To everyone who is live with me today and everyone who is listening after the fact, hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told. This is a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abby, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Claudia Westermann and Chris Speed as we take a communication perspective on stories, exploration, and learning. A communication perspective is about considering what we're making and how we're making it using our communication practices. So this means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So the idea is that whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. So this is a quite different episode from my other ones because we're recording live at the Relating Systems Thinking and Design online conference. We have a Zoom room full of curious participants who will be putting questions in the chat to help guide our conversation. Claudia and Chris are co-presenters at RSD this year for the session Configuring Incompossible Futures. That's happening tomorrow if you want to check that out. And we are kind of thinking of this as a sort of extension of that. A slightly less formal space to get to hear a little more from the both of them about things related to that presentation and maybe some things that didn't get to be a part of that presentation that touch on other areas of their work. Claudia and Chris are both well-recognized designers in their own ways, and so I'm so looking forward to learning with both of them today. As we dive into this conversation, I would have you keep in mind, what is your own relationship to learning? What does it feel like to be new at something, to change your perspective or your practice, and to reflect on both the formal and the informal ways that you have learned in your life? I know a lot of us as educators and academics maybe have that kind of learning front of mind, but I think today we're going to explore some other ways of learning as well. So without further ado, let's jump in with Claudia and Chris. Hello, Claudia and Chris.
Hello.
Great to be here today. Really looking forward to this conversation on learning and the idea of a future, of an open future, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. Great to chat with old friends, but also think about how things have changed in the time that we've been working across a bunch of things, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm so looking forward to learning with and from both of you today. And to get us started, I like to answer the question, all three of us, how are we arriving? And so for me, this is about setting some context. And so I'll go ahead and start us off, give you both a minute to think about your answers. Some context that I am bringing with me is that I've so been looking forward to this conference because last year, RSD 13 was my first time attending the RSD conference, and instantly I just enjoyed the experience so much. I did come in with a little bit of hesitation because I felt that I had kind of come up to the conference in a kind of curious way where I was invited to be a part of this group that was doing a workshop and a paper talk, and felt like I kind of just got to tag along. And so stepping into the physical space in Oslo, I felt a little bit out of my depth as I sit down at a table full of people introducing themselves as I'm this kind of designer, I'm this kind of designer, and everyone's turning to look at me and, and you. And I'm like, am I allowed to call myself a designer? That's not my formal title. I really am kind of finding my footing here. And so I felt a little out of my depth, but I think instantly welcomed, still just maybe some insecurity on my own end. But very quickly, especially in the workshops, which I just couldn't speak highly enough, that happened last year in Oslo, the learning was so incredible and the community was so incredible. And I, even in my kind of insecure state at the beginning, still ended up feeling like I had something to contribute because there was so much great conversation happening. And I know, as someone who studies interpersonal communication, I know that there's so much that goes into setting the tone of a space like that so that people feel that they can share, that they can learn, that they can be new at something, that they can be vulnerable in the ways that that demands. And so I have fond memories and kind of high expectations of what this kind of space can be, both online and in person with this community. And I'm kind of bringing that in as I reflect on the learning I did last year, the learning I've done since the last conference, and the continued learning I'm hoping to do this year. So that's some context for me and how I'm arriving to this conversation. Claudia and Chris, how are you both arriving? Whoever wants to kick us off.
Chris, you want, or
Go for it. No,
I could, yeah.
yeah.
So the kind of context I come from, I have a background in architecture and art. So I finished my architecture education and then decided that maybe there's something a little bit more, something that could push the question of what we are living in a little bit more. So I shifted to art. And one of my mentors, Ranulph Glanville, whom I met at the time, perhaps by accident, he would posit that designing is something everyone does.
Mm-hmm.
But the question then maybe is, so what makes you a designer is maybe when you start reflecting on that kind of activity, you know. So designing is basically part of life. That would be the cybernetic, the second order cybernetic approach to thinking design. But there is a reflective level that possibly makes this an explicit activity. Yeah, that would be my approach, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Chris, how are you
Um,
arriving?
yeah, no, interesting. So a slightly different take on this, I suppose. I'm an English lad, old man, middle-aged anyway. I've been in Nam for about 20 months now, and I suppose leaving the University of Edinburgh, a bubble. Many of you probably identify the bubble of Edinburgh with well, almost a J.K. Rowling Potter world, a World Heritage Site soaked in history, soaked in models of the Enlightenment, the way it organized the world and ended up in Dolly the Sheep, Peter Higgs and his boson toward quantum computing, and then landing on country here. And I do need to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and the Boomwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and landing in and amongst an entirely different ontology, epistemology, a cosmology of knowing has really shaken me, really. So landing, I'm still landing on their country. It's unceded. Shuddering and shaking, but also thrilled to think through what it means to have grown up with a one construct through which design becomes classified, organized, sold, taught, and then rethinking that entirely through a different way of knowing in which the relata just don't correspond, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm arriving with this wonderful conundrum in which I'm beginning to rethink and revisit the things I think as an art student were kind of obvious, that practice and theory and making were bound
Mm-hmm.
together, a research through design.
Right.
And actually, 15 years in Edinburgh, almost asked to dismantle that and put it into different spaces. So yeah, arriving with a joy and a sense of spring, and it's the swooping season, so magpies are coming. They're protecting their young. So I'm ducking and diving as well.
That's great. Yeah, I have a sense that something we'll explore a lot today is that idea of plurality that I'm hearing in honestly all three of our responses to the question of how we're arriving, of just this kind of journey into a maybe more complex way of understanding the world and the richness that comes with that. So I'm looking forward to getting into that with both of you. But before I get ahead of myself, I do want to ask you both to introduce yourselves a little further, knowing a little bit of what we want to talk about today and also not knowing exactly where this conversation is going to go. I wonder what else each of you would want us to know about you. Is there a story that you want to tell, or who are you? Answer that question in whatever way feels best to you. What else do you want us to know about you? Chris, could you start us off?
Yeah, sure. Look, so Chris Speed, I am, well, let's do the technical stuff. I'm technically a professor of design for regenerative futures here at RMIT University in Melbourne. Traveling through, I seem to, look, I'm middle-aged now. I feel like the oldest person in this room looking at you. Next gen people who are going to lift up and take us into a brighter future. So I was born in the 70s. I mean, wow, right? Went to art school in 89, graduated 92, but central to that period of 89 to 92, there was no internet. There were early fax machines I was using. So we're already starting to dabble with the things that a shared professor that we enjoyed hanging out with, Roy Ascott, who we maybe try and get on the call tomorrow, who's an old guy now, but telematically thinking through cybernetics. I was beginning to send messages around the planet in the late 80s. My artwork was fax machines. So that whole journey stayed with me around how on earth do we use communication technologies to fill in the gaps around representation, knowing the world through representation technologies, and then being in the world. And Abby, that stayed with me, that constant glitch where representational technologies allow us to do wonderful things, connect to people. At the same time, they divide and they split. And it's in that wrestling, really. So I've landed in Melbourne really to try and help support collaboration between physicists, chemists, anthropologists, and designers. And that's the design for regenerative futures, very much a systems approach to addressing a university that's already divided into silos. So it's a post systems way of thinking toward curricular research and public and commercial civic engagement. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell, histories and futures.
Okay, Claudia, who are you?
Yeah, I have a background, I mentioned it already, in architecture and art. I met when my background in art is the media art. I was studying at the Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe in Germany, and there were a lot of people connected to the Roy Ascott world of media art. And I met someone there who connected me to Roy Ascott, and that's when I started to do a PhD with Roy on what he called at the time at the Center of Integrative Arts. And yeah, but to think a little bit more about the question of communication and why that is interesting in my work, technology always has played a role, because I realized that the worlds change when there are new technologies. You see this a lot in the arts. Obviously, artists engage with these new technologies precisely for that reason, because they realize that the context completely changes. We see that now with AI coming in again, and there's a lot of a need in a way to kind of push this to really explore what that means, that this new technology is now all around us. But I think I was always interested in these kind of in exploring worlds that I didn't really, I had no access to, I couldn't really understand. I did an exchange during my architectural studies. I did an exchange with Finland. So I studied in Finland, in Tampere for some time, which was a quite different world from the one I knew, because the Finnish have a very different approach to dealing with environments and thinking through nature. It's quite different from Central Europe, I would say. But then also later, in 2011, I was asked whether I would want to join a new program in China. It was at the time, it's a cooperation between a large Chinese university and the University of Liverpool, and they just had created a new architecture program. So in 2012, I joined that program, and there were a lot of challenges of how we deal with a kind of British program within China, and what that means, and how you communicate expectations that are really quite different in these two cultural contexts. The architecture programs in China are very much are already an import, but they come from the US and come from a Beaux-Arts model. Then you come with a British design model, which is quite different, because it has been informed by a more studio-focused learning. and a lot more. There's a lot more focus on experimentation. Anyway, so there is a lot of things to juggle, and one of the key issues in that context is that you need to speak about things others. How do you speak about these things? You can you also you don't necessarily know what the others, what others what they know, how they would. So it's quite unclear how they would translate ideas, concepts, even design briefs, and things like that. So there's a lot of questions in these spaces, but maybe more explicit than in a monocultural space. But technically, in a monocultural space, we would encounter very similar questions. They would just not become so explicit, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense to me and is instantly bringing me back to a previous episode I've done with Dr. Rachel Lilly, who is someone I met at the RSD 13 conference. And we talked a lot about expectations and assumptions. And that was a really interesting conversation to me and does something similar to, what I described a communication perspective as earlier as being looking at communication instead of through it, which is saying, communication is something we take for granted. It is invisible in many ways, but it's very real force. And so can we draw our attention to this thing that we're often overlooking? And so kind of in a similar vein, that conversation was about, can you name the assumptions and the expectations that you have and how they might be getting in your way of what co-creation is happening in relationships? Because to me, when I think about learning in relationships, especially, I think the biggest tool has to be curiosity, because if one of the assumptions that you show up with is, well, I already know everything, then you're not curious, you're not asking questions. And so that's something that I think even myself personally and in this work have really tried to embrace, is this idea that comes from a British systemic psychotherapist that I work with named John Burnham. And he talks about the not knowing position as a very intentional way of showing up to relationships, to conversations, to the systems that you're designing or participating in. Can you embrace not knowing as a strength and as an avenue for learning rather than something that holds you back or feels like, oh, well, I would prefer to know than not know? It feels very vulnerable, obviously. And so as we're talking about learning and the through line of, the relationship the two of you have and the presentation that you're giving tomorrow being about a kind of learning that was, I don't know if you would call it this, but, one way I'm making sense of the story that I've understood is it was maybe a way of teaching and learning that was ahead of its time or was not appreciated in its time. That just becomes a really interesting conversation to me about how do we learn. And for the two of you as I imagine learners in many ways in your lives, but also educators, I'm curious about what your relationship to learning is and what your experience as a learner and an educator has been in terms of like what works and what is interesting and what are you seeing people playing with in your classrooms and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think what you're opening up in terms of is is a huge time of education. The last 30, 40 years has gone through a design which has become constructed deeply toward product, not experience, not
Right.
learning how to learn.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna swear, Abby, because I was taught through the FO methodology. So I went to Brighton Poly. FO is fuck off and find out.
Yeah.
Here's a studio space, Chris. Here's your group of very privileged 30 students. Here's a studio space. We'll see you periodically. Try and go to art history lectures on Wednesdays, but otherwise, it's your space. Just fuck off and find out what you want to do, and we'll drop in. Now, learning outcomes, there were no learning outcomes.
Right.
There was no timetable, there was no construct, no representational construct at all around fine art in the late 80s at Brighton Poly, for sure. Now, of course, over the last 30 years, I've now taught and I've been taught how to implement a sort of design infrastructure which does make promises, it makes contracts, it makes a transaction which delivers with many of the students that I will, you pay this much money, I will guarantee you will have these learning outcomes, these rubrics, which allow us to sustain a contractual relationship. And I think what you're also poking at is, to what extent then are we delivering structured,
Mhm.
organized, designed,
Mhm.
service delivered learning frameworks? Or to what extent are we offering unstructured, unregulated, unlicensed frameworks in which finding and learning how to learn is naive. It's full of mistakes. It's full of a socialization. It's a
Mhm.
full of
Mhm.
watching. It's possibly even the sum of collaborative parts, as opposed to, again, this atomized product-driven turn. So we've seen the commercialization, the organization, and I don't know now. Look, would I pay $50,000 for fuck off and find out? Imagine a car or imagine a coffee based on that premise.
Mhm.
I don't
Mhm.
know. On the other hand, I think all of my resilience, all of the imagination, my curiosity was predicated purely on saying, "There's a studio space.
Mhm.
We'll come back in a week or two and see what you've done, Chris." And that was a horrible void to jump into, absence after
Uh-huh.
school.
Uh-huh.
But on balance, I wouldn't regret a single day of those years.
It's really quite interesting that you mentioned that, because it's what you describe is the what I recognize as the old academy model, continental European art academy model is still alive there in some places. And to some extent, I have had that experience too, studying at the university associated with the Center for Art and Media, which operates to some, well, there are kind of timetables, but in a way, you have the kind of the master apprenticeship relationship and the studio, and basically you can do whatever you want, this kind of thing. Obviously now there are bachelor degrees and masters and so on, and for this reason there needs to be some sort of structure, but it's really the old idea of that, you kind of you explore, you have to find your way, and yeah, you have to push it yourself. And it's interesting in this context because Roy introduced a change to that model. When he designed the first ground course at Ealing College of Art in London, he was going against that model that wouldn't have any structure. And he would introduce things into the art studio that were not previously part of the art studio. He would introduce scientists, psychologists, all kinds of other disciplines into that art studio, and also, um, yeah, he would think through the learning experience, which is of the students, and reflect on that. So I think that was really new at the time. So that was in 61, he became head of foundation studies at Ealing College, then moved to Ipswich. And then what gives the initiation for our panel tomorrow, he became the president and chief executive officer of Ontario College of Art, which is now Ontario College of Art and Design, OCAD, in 71. And he stayed for roughly a year, and maybe not even, and was kicked out again.
Mm.
So, but the reason this didn't work was because, in a way, he was too radical, because he was trying to go against that kind of art academy model, and designing a curriculum that would actually define a learning
Mhm.
experience.
Mm. I'm so interested in what you're saying, for what it's bringing up for me to think about the I have a sense that there's so many systems that we find ourselves being a part of that I think in many ways by design disempower the individuals that are in that system and kind of sterilize the learning process and are not fostering creativity and imagination. And so I'm interested as a response to systems that are designed that way because it was easier, because it makes whoever more money, because it's more productive, and that's what we care about. What's the design response to that kind of design for both of you in terms of how do you design a learning experience in a way that does foster that creativity, the imagination, the relationality and playfulness that can happen interpersonally, kind of intentionally maybe juxtaposed with spaces that kind of suck the life out of learning?
Well, I'll jump in terms of taking it in turns. And look, I don't get me wrong. I think the Brighton Poly problem was deeply problematic because we saw power. It wasn't absent. There was
Mm-hmm.
absolutely power, particularly masculine power being played out, right? So, and Roy's, and picking up Roy later during the Planetary Collegium, the Kaya Star relationships we had, Claudia. I suppose the things that I find fascinating is, and something we're going to introduce tomorrow is this compossibility and incompossibility. The idea of being able to play within structures and then finding the edges of those structures
Mm-hmm.
becoming too restraining, too constraining, and then beginning to pursue a delusion. Let's get out of these structures to allow. So, an example at Edinburgh, when we took over product design, which had turned into a Rhino software course, we asked students to develop a device, a product device for shoplifting. So there's lots of product development in terms of thinking about a product that
Mm-hmm.
might have to do something, but being counter to things that which are perhaps commercial. So I think the most memorable one was Darren had developed. He was going through all of those big stores which sell perfumes on the entry floor. You go in these amazing ground floors, and they're quite beautiful. Gucci from all these amazing perfumes. And what he developed was a small device, which was once he had the sample, he would suck the sample into a small device up his sleeve and capture over time, weeks and weeks, vast amounts of free product, which is very, very, very expensive. But
Mm.
actually, and of course, what we're really asking them to do is not pursue the product line toward design becoming a profit line, a value chain,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
actually trying to think about the hydraulic engineering that required the suck, the discretion required, and the social construct of a daily space, not trying to place pressure on the workers. So really what we were looking at is a systems view of a construct, but
Mm-hmm.
we were trying to dismantle that counter construct. So I think we do try to play, even in the contemporary courses here, play with the contemporary constructs, but also look for countermeasures, look for other ways in which the social, the ecological, the sustainable, the economic can be reframed toward different values. I mean, that's just one idea. But again, I'm trying to think, Claudia, all of the things that Roy did to those early students who were very open, some probably traumatized. And I certainly had to push back on shoplifting. One of the students refused to be bound to a design process that could be associated with transgression. That didn't seem appropriate. But Claudia, the things that Roy did were deeply challenging, possibly unethical, but that's where we're trying to find what design does, the edges of these things.
Yeah, I mean, if we wanted to present these kind of learning experiences to our health and safety teams at our current institutions, we would probably get some pushback because we wouldn't be allowed to do these things. Things like locking students into a room for an hour with the teachers, though, I understand, but without teachers not saying anything, students just letting the students wonder about what this is all about and see how they deal with the situations, we would get a lot of questions for things like this today. We couldn't really do this, or others where they were kind of floating through rooms with like, I don't know, I understand it was like something like a room full of balls and they had to navigate through it or something like that. They could possibly stumble and all these things. There would be obviously today a lot of health and safety concerns, since we can't even go on a field trip around the corner without an application for to the ethics committee in a way, and so on. So, or for health and safety, yeah. So, yeah, I think it's. But I mean, things have changed, but we still can challenge students. I think that's the core idea, and that's what we learned from Roy, probably, to kind of trust or I learned to trust my intuition in what creates a learning experience, and to test out things that wouldn't be typical in a, let's say, architecture curriculum. So to some extent, in all design curriculums, we are when we design tasks for, let's say, first-year students, we try to push them to think outside the box, to kind of not repeat, to develop responses that are not default responses. That's how you kind of push a design student to become a designer, kind of, or challenge a designer to become a designer. In architecture, it's very similar. It's this kind of, everyone knows what architecture is when they arrive at the university. They have an idea of what a house is, and that house. That's what architecture teachers would say, is obviously not architecture. So we kind of challenge students to think spaces in a new way, and to do a first exercise with these students on designing a house would probably be not very effective, because everyone would be, there is too much risk that they fall into a default response.
Mm.
So what you do is that you come up with framings that cannot be responded to with a standard response. So, for example, when I came to China, I wanted to introduce some of the British culture that they would encounter, and wanted to do this in a bit like in a humorous way. So I introduced the idea of a picnic, and how in 19th century British literature, all these picnics would, there's a lot of literature on picnics and how these are socially challenging and how they go wrong and how they become very dramatic and so on. And there's a Monty Python even picnic that is totally bloody and things like that. So we introduced the idea of a picnic and how these are so a very challenging social situation. And then I say, so now you have 3 people on a picnic blanket, and you will need to, I give a kind of characters, very short descriptions. And I tell the students to design a hat for 3 at a picnic that's supposed to moderate that situation. So that would be an introduction into an architectural device in a way. It's not a house, but it's an architectural device. So these kind of tasks. I think I would very much credit Roy for giving me the confidence to do these kind of things.
Yeah, yeah. And I think look, tomorrow, hopefully we get a chance. I'm fascinated in this. I mean, again, it's a Leibniz idea, the compossible. What is it? And referencing some of your early podcasts, Abby, these ideas that we individuals construct, socially construct ideas of the world. Bob Jessup, who's a Lancaster professor, will talk about social imaginaries that each of us,
Mhm.
after the death of ideologies, each of us have social imaginaries which are constructed in his ideas around, on one hand, a lived experience, the things that we touch, the things that we access, the thing that we've got limited privileges too. And on the other hand, we've got ideas of how the world is constructed. And those two things, the model, the meta model, then aligned with how that's allowed us to perform certain acts in the world, give us a compossible
Mhm.
imaginary. The imaginary becomes compossible because of our past experiences. So I might ask you, Abby, how would you, or everyone on the call, how would you get to work tomorrow? Some of you might say, I'll get a bike, I'll walk, maybe I'll get a taxi, I might get a bus. Few of us, I suggest, would say, get a helicopter, because
Mhm.
that's not compossible in
Mhm.
our economies. Some people this morning, honestly, thought about in their imaginary, oh, let's take the helicopter. And that's because of the way that they have structured their understanding of the world and their access to the world. And that makes imaginaries. And I do think the same for educators. To some extent, are we thinking about the compossible, the
Mhm.
traditional architecture brief, the traditional graphics brief, the great packaging brief? Or are we thinking about the incompossible?
Mhm.
That I did, and I think that's what Roy began to do. He began to think of, good grief, I look around and every compossible curricula looks the same, with the same power relationships, the same architecture spaces, the same materials. Hang on. This isn't what an art school should do. It should reflect the incompossible um, opportunities to break down. And I suppose that's that interplay, perhaps some of your work
Mhm.
around imaginaries and the social construct.
Right.
When do they become limited, and when do they just play back the
Mhm.
routines of a very unsustainable late
Yeah.
capitalist society?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Because CMM is just one of many communication theories. And a lot of them and a lot of people's understanding of communication is still rooted in what we would call the transmission model, which is like sender, receiver, message. And it's such a simple way to understand communication. And it just, we do ourselves a disservice if we think it's that simple, because there's so much going on in there. And so the name of this theory says it all. What is communication? It is a coordinated management of meaning, because all it meanings plural. Like there are so many ways to make meaning of the same. This is where the name for the podcast emerges out of one of the specific models of CMM. What's that kind of distance or process from getting to a lived story to a told story? All three of us are sharing the experience of being on this podcast right now, but we'll all turn around and tell different stories about it because of what we're bringing with us and how we're making meaning. And one of the other tools of CMM that I wanted to offer you both and hear what you think about is there's a model called the hierarchy model, and it's about hierarchies of contexts. And in CMM terms, kind of saying within those contexts were the stories that come with each of those. And so it's about kind of distinguishing or naming that, it's not just one amorphous blob of context above us, but what kind of individually is shaping us in a given moment. What stories am I bringing with me right now? Is it kind of relationship stories? Is it a story about this individual episode? Is it cultural stories? Is it stories about myself? That, kind of types of context, types of stories. You could go on and on and on. And I find this to be a really interesting tool. I think it's mostly used kind of reflectively of like, oh, we're listening to a conversation. What are we hearing emerge in terms of the stories that are present in this conversation? But I think it's really could also be a helpful tool for looking forward and being intentional in whatever you're designing or living or participating in, to say, what do I want my highest level of context to be right now? I think the one that we kind of play with the most in CMM is the relationship and the episode contexts. If we're in an argument and I'm putting the episode above the relationship, I may be taking what you're saying at face value, and I decide that I'm very committed to winning this argument, and this episode is what matters right now. If I'm deciding that, the relationship in this moment is a higher level context than the episode, then maybe I would say, you know what, we have a history together and I really trust this person and I feel very safe with this person. And so maybe we'll be a little vulnerable and not, fight so hard, but be able to lean into like a curiosity rather than like a defensiveness or an argumentativeness. And so thinking about these many different ways that each of us individually and together make meanings, what is how's context playing into that, and the stories that emerge out of those contexts, because it is about the plurality of meanings, stories coexisting. The kind of CMM-ish definition of dialogue is, kind of speaking freely your mind, your truth, your story, standing firmly in that, and being profoundly open to others and saying our stories, our experiences can appear to be at odds and they can coexist. And so then how do you act into the complexity of the plurality of all of our experiences?
Yeah, that's so interesting also that you mentioned the title of the podcast is actually is so nice to think through this idea of presentation, and it's a question that we always encounter in any art and design discipline, of how the lived relates to the way things are told or presented. And I recently I was at a training session for supervising Indigenous research, and they stories here in Australia. I just arrived in Australia a month ago, so I'm now associate professor of creative practice at Curtin University. Arriving from China, where I've taught 13 years before that. So the Indigenous in Australia is very different from the Indigenous I encountered in China. It's really quite interesting to think through these differences. There's relationality in both, but it's made explicit in a different way. That's my understanding at the moment, and I'm obviously an outsider reflecting on both of these processes. But there's a story. The story in the Aboriginal context is very important, but there's also something there is a story for you to hear. That's what they told me. Do not assume that the story you are told that you're supposed to hear is a story you are supposed to transmit to others, because it's told for you to learn, but not necessarily for you to publish. And it's an interesting one. I've thought about this for quite some time. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's great, isn't it? It does help us perhaps process the commodification of words that we've seen through the digital economy. Add what we've done in the West through making sense of systems is to break them down into tiny pieces and then commodify and organize, right? That's the relata of systems, which were again, leaving Edinburgh. But to do that through Google AdWords was really easy, that you just associate a price with a word, so that when Claudia types in a poem, I wandered as lonely as a cloud, actually what's going on is AdWords says cloud. Oh, she's looking for cloud computing. Oh, well, in which case we'll sell her. And that systematic that atomization of language from meaning, let alone the idea that we then pick it up and run with it and interpret and hold it with reciprocity back, that's gone. And then, of course, what we're doing with the LLMs is probably another extension of that, right? Again, breaking down, looking for links and vectors between words according to how they were used in the past, based on internet material. And the internet was the biggest marketing machine we've got ever. There's poetry there, but what is it? Less than 1%. So this idea, again, this commodification of language, which turns back into the role that digital systems are doing compared to indigenous knowledges, which really don't. They do something. Yeah, just to play back another story. I've got Enid, who works up in the Northern Territory. She describes, I'm quoting here, Belander, who for us are the white settler. Belander look at the world and see a person there and a tree over there, and they see them as separate. That's so boring. I mean, that those enlightenment systems just wouldn't. And I suggest, Claudia, you probably went through a whole journey there where, traditional Chinese culture just didn't separate out the tree from the land. But of course, as I'm going to go back to my Edinburgh experience, Dolly the sheep, Higgs and his bosun was all understood and organized and promoted as successes of these separation of things, of words.
I think that the other kind of key part for me about the CMM theory and what I think is mirrored in the world of systems thinking and design as well is this idea, which is, really the heart of this conference this year, which makes so much sense to me, is the way we've said it at RSD is relationality and complexity. And that the important part about complexity is how we meet it. And I think a lot of people's inclination, or as Claudia said, default, is to want to simplify complexity, to limit feelings of uncertainty or erase any moments of discomfort. But I think as we, have framed our context in terms of learning, what changes or what doors open or what becomes possible when we, instead of simplifying complexity, learn to navigate it, lean into, exist in the complexity of the plurality of meanings and stories and contexts that each of us are bringing with us. Not an easy thing to do, but it's like saying that the dissonance that happens, the discomfort that might happen when you are facing two told stories that might appear to be in conflict with each other. What can you learn, again, when you meet that with something like curiosity rather than, I think a lot of it, maybe I would say, is even like rooted in a fear, of, I can't hold that in my head. I don't have space for that. And so it is about like developing a skill set or a kind of orientation of being in the world, I think, for how am I meeting complexity in relationality and systems and interpersonally. And so there's so much richness already out of this conversation today. And I'm sorry to say we have to be wrapping up. So as we do, Claudia and Chris, is there any story that you would want to leave us with about anything we've talked about today?
Oh, that's a good one. I don't know. I
Is
think
there any story?
Yeah, any
Chris?
story. Crikey. You're going to have to edit this out of the podcast. The pause.
Awkward silences are allowed.
I mean, I think
embraced, even embraced.
I think, sometimes stories are really not told in words, but they're experienced. And many of those stories that made me learn were actually not really made explicit in words, but they're embodied experiences of a shift in perception, of a sudden openness, of a possibility suddenly emerging, of a different future. And these were probably the most profound experiences of learning, I would say. And in a way, that means also that as educators, we could possibly think a bit more about the kind of experiences we create, of making stories of openness and possibility and diversity, plurality.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, that's what triggers curiosity also. Yeah.
And staying with students is the most extraordinary privilege. Central of the communication is the reciprocity. listening to
Yes.
how
Yeah.
stimulus comes from groups of students engage with lecturers and flattens it into a listening space where you see collective jumps, you see collective misinterpretations, failures, risks, plays, successes that then collectively, and it is amazing watching 30 people, sometimes 60 people we teach with, make jumps as a community. Isn't it just
Mm.
amazing? Just the collective jumps that people make over a 12-week semester, the listening that they do when the pennies drop. Oh, the pennies dropped. And it acts like a ripple and a wave because of not what the tutor does, the power person, but how people in a team communicate, contribute to an artifact. And that shifts the thinking, the interpretation. And then
Mm-hmm.
an act shifts the interpretation. Then a contestation, a critique shifts it. And that collective, and then what we do is measure it individually. It's gone. We snap out of that whole community learning, and we go back to the individual. But again, education from the West has to win somehow, doesn't it, Abby?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, you have me thinking that at the end of these podcasts, I like to return to the language that I introduced at the very beginning of better social worlds. And I'm so much less interested in better social worlds as a place or a destination and more of a process. And, just not that, you know, you can't think about the product or the outcome you want, because it is useful to try to define for yourself what is my better social world? What am I working towards? But can you trust that the quality of the process, the quality of the relating, the communicating, the space creating, the designing that you're doing will get you to the outcome that you wanted, because the quality of the process was tended to so carefully? And so I find that to be so important for learning, that it is that experiential, exploratory, interpersonal, kind of hands-on or imaginative process of getting to engage with. Again, another thing that I love so much about CMM is that emphasis of choices, of getting to try on new meanings and new ways of thinking about things and new ways of acting into communication, and being able to develop the practice of, kind of catching yourself and say, oh, I could say this in this moment. My default is that I want to say this right now, but what if I try something different? What would that make? And that's kind of that language of CMM. And so I think that's such an important framework for us to be considering in learning experiences about what are we making in the process and what's the value that's being extracted out of that process. So Claudia and Chris, thank you so much for everything that you've offered today. Wonderful to learn with you. And to everyone who's on the Zoom with us, thank you so much for participating as well. This is where we will wrap up. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.